papers for thinking about the relationship between leaders and followers. Because relationality challenges some of the assumptions that have been used in conventional ways to think about leadership. And we will talk much more about these as the webinar develops. But one of the points that is here is that the introduction of relationality in this field has created ways of doing research that are very different from ways of doing research. And so when we started the book, we noticed that there were two different perspectives on leadership that had one another. And so the book is really about what happens to our field and our research when we try to bring the idea of relationality. And what we did was invite scholars engaging in a conversation about what this is, so that we could perhaps come to some agreement at the field level.
And so that's really how I got into this, is that Sonia and I, what happened was I came into the space of relationality through leader-member exchange, or LMX research. And in LMX research, it talks about relationality as a relationship. So I was writing about relationships, and I was thinking that I am a relational researcher. And then I discovered all of this work that was happening out there that I had never heard of. And I was really aghast. I was mortified. I'm thinking, around the time 2000, I was thinking that I was having these brilliant insights, and then I start reading Diane Marie Hosking's work from the late 1980s, and she was way ahead of me. She had thought about these ideas that I thought I was discovering in 2000 in the 1980s. So that got me into the exploration of this idea of relational and more of the strong relational theory, which is the background that Sonia brings. So if we then think about what motivated the book, for me what motivated the book was that I was a relational researcher, but I was missing understanding of a large part of the field, and that was the constructionist side. So the challenge for me was that as I started to try to explore that side of the field, I wasn't able to really understand it. So I started reading, but I'm coming across these terms that I'm not able to follow, and I don't know what to make of them. I don't know what to do with them. So they're interesting, and they certainly reflect for me the way that the world works in terms of how people operate together. But as a researcher trained in leader-member exchange and in post-positivism, I had no idea what to do with that. So I wrote an article in Leadership Quarterly in 2006 on what I called relational leadership theory. And at that time, I struggled a lot. In fact, it was the one paper where I was most worried about plagiarizing, because I didn't have the words myself. I couldn't figure out how to explain these concepts very well, so I had to quote a lot and be really careful. It took me a long time to write. And then after I wrote that, around that time, Sonia and I had met because we were talking together about the network of leadership scholars. And then Sonia sent me an email, and she was very positive on the article and said, actually, I wish I had written that article. So we had a phone call and we talked, and as we talked, we began to realize that we had this shared interest in advancing the idea of relational leadership. So it was at that point that we started talking about the book. So Sonia, I'll let you jump back in.
Okay, great. So unlike Mary, I wasn't trained in leadership studies. I was a sociologist who had started to be interested in leadership issues. And so about 15 years ago, when I need to understand the leadership literature, I started reading. And with my sociological lenses, I was less interested in the social psychology and organization perspectives. So I kept looking. I finally found a group who were referring to leadership as the social construction, sociological terms. So people who were saying, well, something that is created out of agreement. And I thought, I can relate to that. And so I entered and started to use that as my research on leadership. But what I didn't realize, I was entering a field that felt that it had a lot of fault lines and geological divides that I really hadn't noticed when I entered. And by the time I had responses that I thought were insightful, I realized that I had entered and was trying to speak to scholars. I didn't understand what I was saying. They were probably my work is less scientific than theirs. My work was in public context, and most of the work was in business context. So I realized that the scholars I wanted to speak with weren't interested in hearing me, or didn't even know that I existed. And it is at that time that I heard Mary's Leadership Network, and thought I can relate to that. And then I read her article, and I was very excited and also disappointed that she hadn't cited my work. But then I realized that I had also written 2006 piece with my colleague Georgia Sorensen, where we talked about the constructionist approach, and we hadn't cited her. So I realized it was really a big divide. And when we got together in Sonia, we realized, yeah.
Sonia, I'm sorry, this is Shelley, and totally as am I. Could you possibly call into your telephone?
For the phone?
Yes, using a handset.
Please send me the number. And then I will mute.
Yes, we will. So maybe Mary can take over for just a couple minutes.
Yes, and Sonia, just let me know when you're back on. You can chat me, and I'll see that you're back on.
Should I get? Excuse me. Shall I get out of the webinar? Together?
Yes, get out. We'll send you the information. Call in phone number.
All right.
We're kicking you out, Sonia. Sorry.
Okay. That must have been very boring.
No. No, you're so good that you're echoing. You're resounding.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Yeah. All right. So I'm out.
Okay. Thanks, Sonia. Let me know when you're back in. Okay. Sorry for the technical problems here. I heard the echoing, but I didn't want to interrupt her because I wanted to let her finish her side of the story there. So it was interesting that Sonia said that I had not cited her because it's an issue in our field that I didn't even recognize her work. And she and I had quite a lot of discussion about this as we were talking over the years and putting the book together, because I kept saying to her, you've got to label it in some way. We don't recognize what it is. We don't know what it is without a label. And she says, well, but that's not how we do our work. I don't need to label it. And I kept saying, well, just call it theory, which is why I called the 2006 paper Relational Leadership Theory. I said, if you do that, then people know that it's a new approach, it's a new theory. And we had some fascinating discussions around that because she pushed back on me quite a lot and said that we don't do that in our field and we shouldn't do that, and theory means something different. So actually, from that standpoint, the book got a different title because originally it was Advancing Relational Leadership Theory, and she went out in that one, and it's now Advancing Relational Leadership Research. So let me talk just a little bit about how we proceeded with the book, and Sonia hinted at this earlier. So the first thing that we did is she and I each tapped into our own networks in our different fields to identify scholars that we wanted to invite. And the criteria were that we wanted a broad range of views, we wanted multiple paradigms, and we really wanted people who were thinking a bit differently so that we could advance thinking in this area. We didn't want just basic review pieces. We wanted people who were pushing the envelope in their thinking. So those are the chapters that we have, which is the scholars. And then what we did is we paired up dialogue scholars. And this part was really fun because at this stage we decided that for each section of the book we would have dialogue scholars who would comment. And then at the end of the book we had a pair of dialogue scholars who commented on the whole thing. So part one of the book is theorizing the practice of relational leadership. And here we paired up David Day and Bill Drath. So Dave Day is more from the post-positivist side. He's a psychologist, an industrial psychologist. And Bill Drath worked at Center for Creative Leadership and has been pushing very much the idea of relational. He was one of the earliest ones. In fact, he was one of the first ones when I was at CCL that challenged me on this idea of relational. And I said, well, sure, I know what relational is. And as I talked with him, I began to realize I really didn't. But I didn't even get it at the time when he was telling me this. So they're great because, yeah, are you back, Sonia?
I'm back.
Excellent.
Just testing, but I still have the echo.
I don't think
So
you do.
I will shift to telephone.
Okay. So Bill and Dave were great because what they did is they have different perspectives, but they're also really good friends. And Bill influenced Dave quite a lot when Dave did a sabbatical there for a year. And Dave started writing about the need to focus on relational, which he was talking about as people interacting together in relationships. So that was a great pairing. The second pairing that we did was Gail Fairhurst and John Antonakis. They did it for this part 2 of the book, which is researching relational leadership. And this one got really interesting because Gail comes out of communication. She has a pretty strong constructionist view. And John comes out of more of the post-positive. He's a broader methodologist. Interestingly, he thinks a lot in terms of numbers. So the two of them struggled quite a bit as they were trying to engage in their dialogue. And there's a lot of rich interaction in their dialogue. And then we had a part 3, which was just dialogue. And here we picked Diane Marie Hosking and Boas Shamir. So Diane Marie is the one I mentioned earlier who had the strong relational theory. She's been doing this work since the 1980s. She's very, very much on the constructionist interpretive side. And Boas is, I think, one of the best scholars in our field. He pushes thinking. He's, I would say, running up against the edge of the post-positive side, really challenging and questioning. But he's also not willing to just give in. So with them, when they started to dialogue, we thought that they would have this great interaction. And what happened was that
Mary, I'm back.
Okay, so Diane Marie invited Boas to the dialogue, and then Boas said, I can't really engage with you in this way, and went off and wrote his own chapter. And then Sonia and I were like, wow, we're not quite sure what to do with this. They couldn't really even engage together on that level. But the exciting part was that Boas was so engaged. He was so intellectually stimulated that he really felt like he had a lot he wanted to say in response to this. So what we had to do then was Sonia and I worked to map out the train, and the last point on the slide here is that really we put the worms back in the can because I had the concluding chapter. It was my responsibility, and it took me forever. And Sonia kept saying, we've got to get this done, we've got to get this done. And I said, but we've got a big mess here. As we were pushing on it and the dialogue scholars started engaging, they couldn't even really talk to one another very effectively. It really broke down. And so the challenge was, how do we now bring this back together? How do we move it forward rather than leaving it as a big mess where people can't really talk to each other? So that was part of the challenge we had in the conclusion, which then got us to the concept of paradigm interplay, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But before we do that, actually, here's the paradigm interplay part. Before we do that, I want Sonia to talk about dialoguing, or the dialogue we had in mapping the terrain. So, Sonia?
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I still hear an echo.
Well, we don't hear it, so as long as you can go on, I think we're okay.
Okay, so I will stumble. So I just wanted to add from what you were saying, that the dialogue was very interesting because it allowed you and I actually to clarify some of the issues that were out there in the field. And what was quite interesting was that we thought that by inviting people to the book and then reading everything, we were going to be able to magically find the common places, and we were going to be able to come out with areas of consensus.
Yeah.
And it was impossible to do that.
Yes.
And that's where we were when, with all the worms out of the can, trying to figure out how to do this. And we really did not want the book to be just a collection of articles around the theme of relationality without it really being something that had some coherence. And so that's where we were when actually Mary stumbled into this notion of paradigm interplay. So Mary, you want to talk about
Yeah, so I got really lucky because as I was trying to write the concluding chapter, I came across this article that was in, I think it's in the Research Methods Journal, and it was by Romani et al., and they define paradigm interplay, which is a respectful interaction between different types of paradigmatic analyses. And this really resonated, and the reason it resonated was this. At one point, and you'll see it in the book, Boas started writing me. And so he and I engaged in this sidebar conversation that we then invited Sonia and Diane Marie to come in on. But Boas was pushing on me, and he said, Mary, is any collaborative activity to you relational leadership? And I thought, oh my gosh, I haven't really thought about that. I mean, I just think it's relational leadership, but I hadn't considered the idea of how it differed from any other kind of collaboration. So that got me thinking. And then Boas also pushed on the idea that does everybody have to agree? And so here I am, in my own head, I'm thinking, oh, you know, as I start this, we're going to come up with some kind of agreement. We're going to all come together, and these researchers are all going to recognize that this is the one way to go. It will be the one best way, and we'll move forward. So that was certainly not the right kind of thinking. So what paradigm interplay did is that let me understand that what we need to do is maintain distinctions. And Sonia really helped me in seeing this, that we can see the connections, but we still have to maintain distinctions in the way that we approach our research, because she's never going to become a post-positivist, and while I can go into constructionist, I still have my post-positive training and I have my own way of thinking. So really the goal with paradigm interplay is to get more accommodating understandings by engaging ideas across perspectives.
Mary, I'd like to make a parenthesis there.
Yes.
To me, the great understanding of paradigm interplay came when I read the example from Romani et al. that talked about how this was a little bit like when you engage in translation with people who are talking in a different language, and where you have words that you're both using in your own language, but there are cultural meanings that are associated to the word, and you think you're talking about the same thing, but in each language the word has a different meaning. And so part of what needs to happen is that we need to translate also the cultural meaning. And so that's what interplay is. It's telling the other person, okay, here's the meaning of what I'm saying. Here are the assumptions that I have. So I don't have to change my assumptions. I just need to make sure that you understand them so that you can hear them. And that to me was like a big insight about the idea of paradigm.
Yeah, and I think that this is something that is a real value in this book, is that we lay out and show how you can do paradigm interplay, but this is something that I think goes beyond relational leadership, and that it's really critical for us as a field that we get to this point of paradigm interplay. The other thing I would say about the word, Sonia, is I remember as I was working through that concluding chapter, what we did is we went back to the chapters and we essentially used them as, we did kind of a data analysis, a narrative analysis. So for each paradigm interplay, we went back and we pulled things that the author said, and then we analyzed, I won't say we coded, we didn't go that far, but we analyzed the narratives to see what they were saying and how it spoke to each other. It was really a fascinating exercise. But Dave Day was trying to say to Bill Drath, you know, we're saying the same thing. I don't get what the difference is here. He kept using this word pizzled, which really cracked me up. He said pizzled, he heard in a TED Talk, it was a combination of pissed off and puzzled. And as the dialogue went on, he said, I'm getting pizzler and pizzler. So he was really struggling. And then when I looked at it, what I realized was he was using relational to mean one thing, and Bill Drath was using it to mean something quite different. And Dave thought they were saying the same word, but they really weren't. So paradigm interplay helps us to see this. So the other important thing in understanding that and why Dave was struggling so much is this idea of mapping the terrain and the paradigm that we come from. So in this next picture, I'm going to let Sonia explain this. But if you look here, you'll see down in part 1, this is a figure that we have, I think, in chapter 1 or in the introduction, where you'll see that Dave Day is over here on this post-positive side and Bill Drath is over on the interpretivist. So they're both using the word relational, but Bill's in a very different paradigm from Dave. And Dave didn't understand that other paradigm enough to really capture where he was going with it. So Sonia, you want to jump in on this one?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, sure.
So, well, actually, one of the interesting insights from the work in the book was that we realized that rather than a humongous divide with a very big split in the middle, what we had was really a little bit of a continuum that went from what you have on the left side of this graphic, which is people thinking that relationships means that there are two separate individuals who connect to one another, but they already exist before the relationship starts. And then at the other end of the continuum, the postmodernists stand on the right-hand side, people who think that individuals don't exist by themselves, but they exist just in relationships, right? Which is kind of like the essence of the idea of relationality. So both sides are talking about relationships, but are talking about them in very different ways. So what you have in this graph is, on the one hand, the distinction between where people fit within that continuum between whether you privilege in the individual dimensions of leadership or whether you privilege the collective dimensions of leadership in your work. And what we tried to do was the upper part of the map gives you the philosophical assumptions that are underlying the way people make the choices about their research and the way they're thinking about leadership. And the lower part of the map is how we divided the book in 3 parts that talked about with authors that talked about the theoretical issues was part 1, and then authors talking about methodological issues and research and telling research stories, which was part 2, and then the final conversation of the entire book, which was part 3, which ended up being a lot bigger than we expected because of the story that Mary was telling, where Mary and I ended up being part of that conversation, which was something we hadn't designed before, but we thought would be helpful once Shamir invited us into the conversation. And so that ended up being a larger piece. The other piece that I would mention from these graphs that you're seeing is the people who are bolded are the people who were engaged in the dialogues, and the people who are not bolded are the people who contributed particular chapters. You will also notice then that people fit into different places in the continuum depending on whether they are taking more of what Mary has called an entity perspective, which is this, people who see reality as something that exists out there, or the constructionist perspective, which is where people actually see the world as constructed as it is happening. And so this chart gives you a sense of the different people that participated in the book, where they fit, and what we do in the book is kind of like open up and understand what are these philosophical assumptions, and then let people talk in their own voices about the struggles that they had. But the nice thing is you can go back to this map and see where they fit as you're reading what they're talking and how they're talking about relationality. And then at the end, you can go to the chapter where we do the interplay, and then you can see how we're trying to weave in the pieces where there seems to be convergence, not agreement, but convergence and resonance in ways that are helpful field, because now we don't have to think about choosing one side or the other one. We can say we're writing from within this particular paradigm, from within this particular worldview, and with its implications for research, but we can now hear somebody who's writing from another paradigm, because now we understand what are the assumptions that they're using.
Okay. I've been fooling with my headset while Sonia was talking, so is this better? Is the echo better, Anita?
Yes, it is. So both of you should be able to dialogue as you should, as we had planned. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Are you? Am I with echo also?
No, you sound good to me.
Okay, great.
Okay, so then I was fooling with some other things, Sonia, so I'm a little off track of where you were in this. You finished the mapping the terrain.
Yes.
Will you keep going and I'll jump back in? I was typing with Anita on as we were figuring out the headset issue.
So once we want to tell you a little bit about what were the major discoveries that we had for the that came out of the book. And so after we did the interplay and the work that Mary was talking about, where we went back to every single chapter and looked at and did an analysis of what people were saying and really tried to understand the assumptions, we realized that in fact there were 3 areas of agreement, even though there are differences in the way people think about these ideas. And the first area of agreement is that everyone was saying, well, of course leadership is not something that is out there walking in the world. Leadership is something that gets to be co-constructed between people who are trying to do something together. Now, obviously, co-construction means something different from people that are coming from the more entity perspective than people who are coming from the constructionist perspective. But there was a space there where everyone agreed that leadership had to do with processes and that it emerged from relationships rather than it being what created the relationships in the first place. So clearly, there was a conversation that was much more profound around the idea to think about emerging processes and also the intersections of different relationships that people have. And so that was kind of like the first big insight. And we talk a lot about what that means. In the book, we talk about what it means for each of the 2 perspectives and look for places in between. The second big insight was the idea of that leadership is a relational process. And well, of course, that's what we've been saying throughout the entire webinar. But the point is the idea of process as key. The fact that that if we really want to understand relational leadership or the idea of relationality when we think about leaders, we have to think about the relationship between the leader and the follower within a broader, a much bigger process where lots of other things are happening that need to be incorporated into that relationship. And so the point here that was common to everyone was a big preoccupation with how do we study process, how do we make sure that we have the right methods to think about leadership in time so that we can see what things emerge over time and what things change over time. So that preoccupation is there for everyone in the field, independent of how they're understanding issues of leadership. And then the third big insight there was this idea about the fact that we all agreed, independent of where we were in that continuum, that leadership is something that can be developed. It's not the notion of either you're born with it or you're not, but it is something that can be developed and that actually should be developed. And in this particular context, I was very excited, for example, with the insight about the idea of leadership development, that we actually were able to identify 3 very different ways of thinking about this. The first one is the more traditional that we know, which is really about leader development, which is this notion of people needing to understand themselves and get new skills so that they can position themselves differently in the world with relation to others. And that's one way of thinking about leadership development. And then the second way of thinking about leadership development is about the interpersonal relationships. So it's about how do people practice being in relationship with others and how do they gain the skills to be able to develop the leadership in others. So that's a second level at which people need to think about their own leadership development. And then there was the third leadership development idea that comes most from constructionism, but it's about organizational development of leadership. But it's about how do we create leadership capacity in the organization, not just in individuals, but in the organization, so that there are multiple sources of leadership that are different from just the leader or the formal leader. And so there was a lot of conversation, for example, between David Day and Bill Draff about what leadership development meant, because David thought that when he talked about interpersonal leadership development, he was talking about relational leadership development. And to some extent he was, but he wasn't taking it far enough. And what Bill kept saying was, well, okay, that's good, but it's not enough. We also need to think about how do we develop leadership in our processes, in our structures, in the ways the organizations are organized, so that people actually can take up their own leadership without having an individual person having to influence them all the time. So that, I thought, to me was quite interesting.
So I think that's great. And the one thing I would add, Sonia, is that, and you said this earlier, that this might seem really obvious, that these things that we're writing here, of course, leadership is co-constructed, but what's most important about this is that as a field, particularly in the very traditional post-positive approach to leadership, we don't see it that way. We've studied it as individuals, and we've studied it heavily as individuals' perceptions. We focus on leadership development as self-awareness and as training me how to work with another individual and recognize individual differences. So the fact that we had such strong agreement that leadership is co-constructed, and in this point 2 on relational process, that we needed to consider leadership as embedded in context, was a huge breakthrough. And I think one of the most exciting things about the book is this strong statement that this is the area that we need to move forward in the field. Okay, so let me go to the next one in terms of the key takeaways. And Sonia, I think you were going to grab these first too.
Yeah. So in addition to the insights that we just presented, we actually had 4 big insights that we had from the process of writing the book. And to start with, we said, okay, the idea of relational leadership should be considered this umbrella concept that covers any efforts that see leadership as emerging from social processes and relationships among people, independent of whether the scholar is or the practitioner is privileging more the individual or more the collective dimension. But we do argue that there needs to be a commitment to a view of relationality that makes us want to push the envelope. So we should all agree to deconstruct and make more evident the underlying assumptions of our work, and as practitioners, deconstruct the underlying assumptions of our work so that we know where we're coming from and how that has implications for what we want to do. And so we had 4 takeaways, and the first 2 are about process, and the second 2 are more about content or substance. So these first 2 had to do with the idea that if we accept that all different positions are valuable and they can contribute something to the broader conversation without us having to become part of the other field, then we have to be committed in our pushing the envelope to interdisciplinary study of leadership. And these, we all say this already, but we see these as can be done in several ways. In one way, it's research that stays within your own discipline, but where you do interplay with other disciplines. So for me as a sociologist, to do interplay with my social psychologist friends whom at first I didn't connect to, becomes an important element that needs to be part of my research. And in that sense, I would be doing interdisciplinary study. Another way, which doesn't have to be the only way, but is a good way, is researchers from several disciplines engaging in collaboration in the same kinds of projects and trying to bring on in their own perspectives to illuminate the phenomenon. And a third way in which you could do interdisciplinary study would be to create more spaces where people with different disciplinary backgrounds can come together and talk about their work and do exchanges and learn from one another without necessarily having to be completely socialized into the other disciplines, because that would make sense.
And I would say, as far as ILA, I think this fits ILA very well, because I think this is a lot of what ILA does.
That's exactly true. That's exactly true. And the second takeaway is kind of a continuation of the first one, which is no matter what strategy of interdisciplinary work you take, you have to be committed to engage in the idea of paradigm interplay. And what this is, you have to have a respectful multilingual approach. You have to do respectful multilingual conversations with others, because this is the only way that we're going to break the silos and generate an understanding that is at the field level and not just about independent schools of leadership that are kind of like where people are just talking to one another. And so, though, Mary, I think you were going to talk about the second 2 that are more about substance.
Yeah, and on that, just to build on your point about the respectful dialogue, what was most surprising to me, I really didn't expect it, was how hard it was for these dialogue scholars to talk across the different paradigms. I had no idea. I mean, I knew we selected people that respected each other, and we knew that they would be able to talk, and so we were very, very fortunate with the people who joined on. But even with that, the emotion that came up as people's assumptions were being challenged or as there was lack of understanding, it's just really hard. So I think that we're advancing the idea of paradigm interplay, but we have to recognize that that's not an easy thing.
That's a great point.
Yeah, points 3 and 4, the focus on relationality, that's really a passion that I have. I think that was my primary motivation in the book, was to really explore this idea of relationality and that it's more than relationships. I think I started off thinking that relationality was relationships because it's about social exchange and how individuals engage together. And what this book did was really broaden me to understand that relationality is not just about that. It's about things being in relation. So the focus in relationality is how are we in relation and how are we connecting together in relation. So that inherently then goes to point 4 of bringing context in. I have a couple of pet peeves. One is that we focus too much on individual and not enough on the in-relation idea. But a second one is that in leadership research, we've really not done a good job of addressing context. So because we've come out of a psychology perspective, primarily, at least I will say I have, and most of the people that I know that do the traditional kind of leadership research come out of that perspective, we recognize that context matters, but we include it as a variable. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's not a legitimate way of thinking about the real world of leadership. So we've been challenged to push this idea of social context, and to me, relational leadership helps us really get there.
Yeah,
okay,
I would say about that we actually need to switch our way of thinking about context, not as background, but as foreground. Context is where leadership emerges, and so you can't kind of like hold it constant while you look at the relationship. You have to see how the relationship emerges in very, very particular, historically localized contexts, because that's what's going to give you an insight into how that relationship is emerging and unfolding over time. And I think part of what the field has done so far is to think that the context is like the background in a theater play, and you can just keep shifting little bits and pieces, but the focus is really on the actors playing, when in fact the actors without that context don't make sense.
And that's spoken as a true constructionist, Sonia. So I would say there are many other leadership scholars who would say, no, I think the actors should be foreground. So it really is about the different perspectives, and so Sonia just represented the constructionist side.
That's absolutely true, and part of what is very challenging for us constructionists is to think about how do we operationalize that in research? How do we do research that allows us to capture that? And that's something that we can talk about later if people are interested.
Okay, so Sonia, we're nearing the end, so we've got a couple of slides left here. What we want to do is ask ourselves, how did it deepen our own thinking and scholarship? So will you start with that one?
Sure, and I'll be brief here. I think that for me the biggest insight was gaining really a deeper appreciation of the sophistication and interesting thinking that was going on in the more traditional perspective, which I had kind of like set aside to just think more about this in constructionist terms. And by being able to actually engage with people and understand their assumptions, I really learned a lot about leadership that was very important to bring into my own thinking. And the other thing that was really helpful was that Mary and I kept being engaged in the conversation between the two paradigms, and Mary was really very helpful in a very relational way in terms of pushing me gently and saying, well, what do you mean by that assumption? As I was trying to write and explain to her assumptions about constructionism, which is an interpretive perspective of social science, she kept saying to me, I don't get it. Why are you saying that? And she kept challenging me in a very relational way, which led me to understand that I was taking for granted a lot of the assumptions about constructionism in a way that once I clarified them, I was able to communicate in a very different way. And also I was able to learn a lot more about my own perspective of leadership by doing that. So the conversation itself, first with Mary and then with the rest of the scholars, and reading the papers and understanding it very well, really formed me and made me a leadership scholar. I don't think I was one before that. Now, with 15 years of thinking about it, through this book, I think I became fully a leadership scholar.
And what I would say was I was so grateful that Sonia was so patient with me in my questioning about philosophy of science. I mean, I am open enough to say that because of my training in leader-member exchange and in the post-positive side, we don't get trained in philosophy of science. So a huge part of my struggle was just understanding the basics of it. And so Sonia would teach me about ontology and epistemology, so it was like she had to go back to Methods 101 for her. And even with that, I think I was a slow learner. It was a really hard thing for me to get my brain around in terms of what that means. So I think that this book, for me, helped me to finally get it, to really be able to understand the different paradigms. And I think that for people reading this book, I hope it comes across that way, what we tried to do was put a primer together for people like me who really were trying to recognize that there's a different way of looking at things and that there is this other paradigm. But many people from the post-positive side just dismiss the constructionist side because it's too hard to get our brains around. It just sounds too crazy to us when we start talking about it. So Sonia was an amazing teacher and really helpful in that. And I also have a much better understanding of qualitative approaches. So Sonia, coming out of the qualitative side, we had a lot of discussion around what rigor means in the qualitative versus the quant side. And so I think that that's something else that I really benefited from. Okay, so Sonia, we need to wrap up and go to questions. I'm going to quickly run through these last couple slides, and then you can jump in. But
sure, go ahead.
What are the challenges of the multi-paradigmatic approach? And I'm going to say, because I came out of the post-positive side and I deal with a lot of post-positivists, we don't know philosophy of science, so it makes it very hard for us to understand this. And I think that what we need to do is become more conversant and more literate on the different paradigms. But I know from my own experience that takes time and resource and energy, and I think that for a lot of people that can be a challenge. So you have to be pretty motivated to want to do this, but I hope that more people in our field will recognize that that's where we need to go. The structure of incentives of the field also fosters specialization and fragmentation. So I would, in many ways, I think I would have been, okay, I don't know if I should say that I would be more heavily rewarded, but I was definitely rewarded for being in leader-member exchange and becoming famous in that area. And when I jumped out of it, it was more of a challenge for me to think about and for others to recognize what I do and who I am. So I think that it's difficult to take the kind of path where you're broadening out and going to a broader scholarship approach versus staying in the specialization. And clearly we teach our doctoral students that. Okay, Sonia, why don't you just quickly do the research and practice and then we'll
done. Right, so the first bullet, we've talked about it, so I'm not going to. And the second bullet, I think we've also done, but it's basically saying how the book itself actually has a lot of very interesting practical implications for people who are less interested in the research component and more interested in learning about these issues from a relational perspective. So, for example, there's chapters about diversity, about leadership development, about psychodynamic theories of relational leadership, about the role of language and stories, about political processes, about there are stories about leadership in the policy process and stories in the civil society, and so there's a lot of stuff there that has very good, interesting insights for practice. And I want to jump to the last bullet here because I think it's important to say that I think that the great challenge for us in terms of practice is to figure out if we take seriously the idea of relationality, and not just from the constructionist perspective, but also from the entity perspective, we need to think more directly the implications that that has for the guidelines that we're offering to leaders and practitioners. Because it's very easy to talk about here are the skills that you need and here are the traits that you need to develop, but it's a lot harder to think about what needs to happen for you to be a leader that focuses on the collective dimensions of leadership. What does that mean in practice? I think a lot of that is still not clear in our minds, and to some extent that's what we're trying to do in different contexts. Like that's what I'm trying to do here with the Research Center of Leadership in Action, trying to figure out how do we translate these ideas into very practical elements. And Mary, you might want to say something about training scholars because I know that's your baby.
Yeah, but I'm not sure that we have time, and I really want to make sure that we leave time for questions. So, Anita, do you want to take over at this point?
Absolutely. Thank you so very much. And I sent everyone a message, but I want to apologize on behalf of ILA for the technical challenges while we work with the provider. I was frantically in the background working to get this resolved. We appreciate your patience and your understanding while we resolve this technical difficulties that we had that came up once we went live. So my apologies again. There are a few questions, and I'm sure that Mary and Sonia will be jumping in to respond to them. And while we're doing that, I wanted to let you know that this webinar will be archived, and we can provide you with the information about that, and you will receive an email with instructions for that. We welcome your questions for the webinar. Please feel free to go to the question box on the GoToWebinar and type in your questions, and Mary and or Sonia will be glad to answer them.
Okay, so Sonia, do you have any questions showing for you?
No. Okay, yeah. Actually, one just came up. It says, would love to know more about training scholars. So Mary, there you go.
Ah, there you go.
Would you like to talk about it? I know this is really important for you.
About training scholars. So one of my thoughts, and I've been pushing this really hard, and I actually ran a session at Academy of Management last year in OB talking about surfacing problems and proposing solutions. It had really predominant people. It had former presidents of the Academy of Management. And one of the things that came out of that and that I was really pushing and some others agreed with is that we do need to train scholars in philosophy of science. I think that it's just horrible that we give people PhDs and they don't understand that that they even have a paradigmatic perspective. So if you're trained like I was, you have no idea that you even are a post-positivist. You don't have any idea what that term means. So I think that we need to train scholars in philosophy of science to the extent that they understand that there are different perspectives. That's the important part there. And the other thing that I've been doing everywhere I go is talking about the constructionist side, because most of the people that I talk with are not constructionists. Of course, if they are constructionists, I probably lean toward more of the post-positive entity side and try to advance that thinking. But I'm really pushing people to the idea of constructionism and the fact that to train scholars, we need to recognize that side. We need to do a better job of getting at these kinds of issues of process, context, and dynamics. And the way that we do that is by broadening our methods training. So we have to think differently about methods. Methods are not just statistics. It's not just analyses. Most people think methods is statistics. So we need to get people more exposed to the wide range of methods that are out there.
I would say that from my perspective, being in the School of Public Affairs, another piece that I would love to add to the training is how do we make sure that people who write in different journals in public affairs and in business or management journals talk to one another and also understand that there are interesting context issues that can be learned from comparing the different sectors. Mary, are you showing some questions?
Yes. So
you want to take one?
One of them earlier was sharing a bibliography, and what I would say on that is that the book probably has it. So if you are interested in learning more about the bibliography or the readings that are out there, the book has it in all of the chapters and the references. It's probably one of the most thorough ones in terms of providing that kind of information.
Okay, I have here another question that says, I am a long-time leadership practitioner and very young leadership scholar. My approach is more pragmatic as a result and look at integrated views in leadership. Are you seeing more research in relational leadership from the integrated perspective? Well, I mean, I actually, the way I would like to approach this is to say that the integrated perspective needs to be more than bringing kind of like the different insights from different perspectives and just connecting them all in a single model. If we take seriously the idea of relationality, then the idea of integrated views of leadership needs to really consider what those different insights mean in the larger cultural context of the work. And so I do think that there are interesting things happening there, but I don't know, Mary, if you know specifically about models that try to do integrated views and how they connect to relationality. Have you seen that?
What I would say is that I think on the post-positive side, there's a lot of interest in collective leadership right now, but which is a relational view. But I think that it's doing it more from a variable and an entity perspective, and so it's using variables with boxes and arrows, which to me is somewhat problematic. As far as others, I mean, there's some other relational view models out there. I think complexity leadership is a relational view. There's a lot going on in other countries and outside the U.S. on relational views. So I don't know if that answers it, Sonia, but that's the best I can come up with.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm hoping that in the conversation that we're having at NYU Wagner at the end of April, where we're inviting 50 scholars who are interested in this idea, we will be able to see what people are actually doing and how they're integrating these different pieces.
Well, there's also the one at Center for Creative Leadership in June that you and I are going to both be
true. That's
doing it as well. So I think that I think this is an area that's going to take off. There's a struggle in terms of how to get it going, because in the past in leadership what we thought about was that if you're going to advance an area, you advance a measure. And this is really not about advancing a measure. I think that's the biggest difference.
Right. So there's another question here about someone who says, I'm working on my dissertation proposal and I'm building it on cross-paradigmatic epistemology. Wow, that's great.
Yes.
However, I did not yet know how to design my methodology. Will your book offer me guidance? I actually think it will. It won't give you formulas, but it will give you a deep understanding of the issues so that you can become very creative in terms of how to put together your methodology. Because I think one of the things that comes out of the paradigm interplay is much more creativity around how you can organize your work and clarity about what assumptions are behind the way you're designing your work, which is also important. Mary, do you want to add something to that?
I would agree. I think it gives an understanding, it gives a conceptual understanding that in one place, in one source, that you wouldn't find. Otherwise, you'd have to look to lots of different things to be able to find the information. Is it going to give you an answer to say this is the design you should use? No. That part you're going to have to figure out. But I think that you can get that from methods books if you have the conceptual understanding. And actually, I have one here from Dan Dayton. Hi, Dan. You're out there. He says, not a question, but a comment. I've been using Advancing Relational Leadership Research since late 2012 in the doctoral course I teach on leadership. I have several doctoral students completing their dissertations whom I've required to read this groundbreaking book. So I think what he's saying is that helps his students to get a perspective, but of course it's still then the job of the student and the faculty members to work through the design.
Do you have more questions?
I do. I have one, and Sonia, you might be able to answer this one. It says, could you say something about research in religious leadership?
Wow. Well, I think that you could look at it from either perspective, right? But what is interesting about religious leadership is that it goes it focuses on a lot of issues connected to worldview, and so it's a lot harder to operationalize from an entity perspective. So I actually think there's a lot of opportunity to do more collective, a more collective approach by looking at the narratives that people use and how they help understand the way people are trying to do leadership. But I wouldn't be able to specifically tell you there's this study that is happening out there. Sorry.
So
Here's
Sonia,
yeah.
I realized that there were a bunch of questions. I had to scroll down to find them. So let me quickly go through a couple of these. One is, to me, how have your views of complexity leadership theory changed with the interplay of relational leadership theory within complex adaptive systems? I would say that these two things are very consistent. I see complexity leadership as a relational view. The difference is, and where I really got clarity was, I kept saying, what am I? Because it was clear that Sonia was a constructionist, and it was clear that a lot of my colleagues are post-positivist. And I was sitting there going, well, what the heck am I? I don't fit anywhere. And as you look at that mapping the train picture, I'm smack dab in the middle. And so actually Boiseau and McKelvey, Max Boiseau and Bill McKelvey wrote a beautiful article in AMR in 2010 where they laid out the philosophical underpinnings and paradigmatic perspective of complexity. And so what I would say is that it recognizes that there are individuals, but they're also operating in connection. So this was one of the major stress points in the book, and some of you'll remember this. The biggest problem Dave Day had, and why he was getting so mad, is because he kept interpreting the constructionist to say that there's no individual. And finally, I think, Sonia, in the end, we said there is an individual, right? You would go there to say that, wouldn't you?
Absolutely.
And that's the biggest breakdown between the entity and the constructionist, is that the entity people hear this, that there's no individual, and there is. So I think that this process really helped me get the conceptual understanding, the philosophical understanding to be able to approach my complexity work.
There are lots of other questions, but I think we hit the time.
I think we did. I'd love to answer these other ones. There's some great questions. Sorry, we're out of time.
We can take a few more moments if the two of you have the time to do so.
I do. Let me answer this one. This is a great one. So can you say a little more about how LMX differs from relational leadership? Yes, I can. I would love to answer that question.
Mary, and also, Mary,
Yep.
there's one here that's about the same, so you might want to include it there. It says, just scroll back. I'm sorry. I can't. Okay, go ahead. I can't find it.
Okay, if you find it, let me know. But
yeah.
So LMX is really a strong post-positive perspective. And what it does is it says that it studies relationships, but really what it does, and you'll see Gail Fairhurst talk about this a lot in the book. So Gail is the one who really helped me understand this. It says that it's about relationships, but it uses a 7-item summary measure, perceptual measure from the subordinate about the relationship with the manager. So I don't think it's really very relational at all. I think it's very individual. It's certainly, and this is why I struggled so much, because I was trained by George Grain that leadership is a relationship. So I always understood leadership as a relationship. I think that's why I'm into relational leadership, and that was why Anson Sears also is in this book. I'm very much trying to advocate different approaches, because we understand and recognize the relational element. But LMX is, in my opinion, really flawed, because it's just a perception of the subordinates. It does it in 7 items. I think it's done a great job of letting us know that relationships matter and are important, but I think it's reached its limit. I know the LMX scholars will disagree with me on that, but we need to push farther, because the big questions I had in LMX were, okay, so how do we get relationships? How do they develop? Well, we've never answered that. Why haven't we answered that in LMX? Because it's too hard to study, and we can't do it with the measures that we have. So the important critical things that need to be addressed, in my opinion, really go more into relational. Now, one quick follow-up on that. The LMX scholars are trying to use the term relational, and I'm really asking them, begging them to not use that term, because I think it ruins the term. They aren't doing relational in the way that we're talking about here, and I think we really need to reserve the term relational to get at it broader. Now, if we do a multi-paradigmatic perspective, that's one angle on it. So yes, LMX can inform relational leadership from the multi-paradigmatic perspective, but it can't own it, because relational is much broader.
There's I found the question that says, I'm currently writing a paper regarding LMX. Could you elaborate regarding in-groups and out-groups? So you've talked about it, but do you remember the reference of the chapter that we wrote and that you invited me to collaborate with you?
Yeah, that was in Dave Day's Oxford Handbook of Leadership. So it was a couple of years ago.
Right. So that's an amazing piece of literature review on LMX going into the relationality piece of it. So you might want to look at that one.
It looked at it from both sides versus others which just review LMX research. What we did is it was Sonia, John Maslin, and me. Sorry about my throat. And John helped me review the LMX side. Sonia reviewed it from more of a relational side, and we tried to provide a broader perspective on it.
Right. There are too many questions. I don't know which one to choose. I'm sorry. I'm just going down. Do you want to choose another one, Mary?
Let me see.
Oh, well, here's one that came up in the book a lot. So it says, if the primary phenomenon is to a process of co-creation, why even call it leadership instead of a new term?
Yes.
So I wish we had... Boaz Shamir kept asking us the same question over and over.
And I have an answer. I have an answer for that.
All right, go ahead.
There's a lot of debate about this. I get pushback on it a lot. I was doing a complexity leadership symposium at Academy, and somebody passionately was saying this isn't leadership. And so I've heard it a lot. I say we need to stay with leadership on this, because if we don't, then we lose what the phenomenon of leadership is. And the real issue is that we need to change the way we think about leadership. So we've got to be really precise, and this is where Boas, I have had so much insight from him and his reaction to this issue, also with Matt Alvison in my conversations with him. You know, the bottom line is when you take leadership out of the hierarchical manager-subordinate relationship, what happens is you get challenged to say, what is it really? So now you're truly at the construct, which we don't often get to in our field. We talk about it from a measure standpoint or operationalizing or a variable, but this really gets at the construct. What is the construct of leadership? And Boas is the one who's been pushing, and I also heard it from Paul Cilliers in Complexity, that really it's about asymmetry. So it's about asymmetrical relationships. And in my opinion, what that means is that the asymmetry is leadership occurs when you have someone who's leading and someone who's following. You can't have leadership without those two pieces together. So my feeling, and we wrote this in the last chapter, is really it's in, and I'm going to just do a play on words here. You could argue the other side. But it's in following that leadership is created. Because I may say I'm a leader, I'm a manager. I may say I'm doing all of this great stuff, but it only becomes leadership if other people are willing to follow me. So leadership as a behavior then, or as a process, becomes this combination of influencing and deferring, or leading and following. And it's that together that we need to be studying. And we need to call it leadership because that's how it is operationalized in organizations, and we need to start changing the way that people and organizations do this.
But so I actually, here I do have a pushback because I don't like to use the word followership as part of the followers as critical, because I think the leader-followers idea is very much embedded in the notion that the leader is the source of leadership and the follower is the recipient of that leadership. And so to me that's half the story. Half the story of leadership is about a real person initiating a process. The other half of the story is about other people taking up what that means. But I wouldn't necessarily call them followers, because it might be that if the leader has a more collective perspective of it, what the leader is initiating is the possibility of others to take up their leadership. And so do you call them followers when what you're doing is opening up space for others to learn and take up responsibilities to move the work forward? I don't think so.
You and I have engaged in this debate, and I think the real issue is that when you hear the word follow or followership or follower, you think of a role. And if you listen to what I said, I didn't say follower, I said following.
Okay.
I said it's in following that leadership is created.
Yeah.
So it's about the behavior of following, and I don't know that one, and in fact, I even privileged following by saying it's following that leadership is created. So I think the problem is that when we get into that term, we immediately go to position, we go to role, and we think that there's one, and I don't see it that way. I see it as behaviors that individuals are engaging in to co-construct leadership.
Well, this is a big conversation. And so
yes, and we're going to have that in New York soon, and I'm going to have it with Boas too. So.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. I think we're ready to close. And thank you all for the questions. I think we could have gone on with more, but thank you for sticking with us through that.
They were very interesting questions.
What a wonderful presentation, and thank you both, Sonia and Mary. And I really love the dialogue that the two of you have. At this time, we're bringing a close to the questions, as Mary said, and I want to thank both Mary and Sonia for taking the time to be with us today. For all who are attending, if you enjoyed today's webinar, I hope you'll be able to join us for our next webinar, the Leadership Perspectives webinar's title on Hacking Leadership, and that's going to be with Mike Myatt, and it is Wednesday, April 16th at noon Eastern Time. So you can go online to www.ila-net.org to register, and we hope to see you again in 2 weeks. If there are additional questions that you would like to ask the presenters, feel free to send us an email at membership@ila-net.org, and I will make sure that they get those questions and to answer for you. So thanks everyone for attending, and we greatly appreciate you being a part of the Leadership Perspectives webinar. Have a good day.
Thank you.